Hey, what's going on YouTube? This is Devin with Jurassic Magic, and in today's video, I'm going to be upgrading the new Precon that is coming out of Edge of Eternities, and that is World Shaper. And out of the two Precons, and you heard me right, there's only two Precons in this set. This one is my personal favorite one. It goes with a Lands Matter theme along with a Sacrifice theme. In Jed color combination, it is pretty basic and true to form because that's usually known for landfall / sacrifice shenanigans. So this Precon is pretty cool. I just want to discuss with you what I am going to go over today as far as the upgrade goes. I'm first going to talk about the commanders, the new cards, and the reprints. And then later on, I'll discuss 10 cards to take out and 10 cards to put in. Some of them are budget, some are not so budget. It really depends on what you want to do. Of course, there's a lot of crazy cards that you could put into a landfall deck. However, before I do get started in this video, I am now in partnership with Baron of Dice. I do have a link down below in the description. They recently launched a lot of cool TCG accessories like deck boxes and playmats. They're known for their dice. However, they have a lot of cool stuff, like this Woodland Elemental deck box that I got recently from them. And I think this would work perfectly with the new World Shaper Precon because this is all about landfall, and it just honestly feels right. And of course, there's a very cool playmat behind this with the dragon. So if you are in the market for some cool deck boxes or new playmats, definitely go check out my link down below in the description to get 5% off. And so without further ado, let's get it started by upgrading this new commander. So in this deck specifically, there are two commanders that you could choose from, the front-facing commander and the backup commander. And both of them are pretty much doing similar things. If you chose one or the other, it wouldn't be that big of a deal because they focus on lands and sacrificing them. Even though they focus on that synergy, they both do it in a different way. Hearthhole the World Seed for 1 black, red, and a green. It's a legendary artifact spaceship with a 6/7 body. It has the station ability. Tap another creature you control, put a charge counter on it equal to its power on the spacecraft station, only as a sorcery. It's an artifact creature at 8+, so it has two different plus modes. With 2 charge counters, you can pay 1, sacrifice a land, and tap it, draw 2 cards. You may play an additional land this turn, and if you have 8 or more charge counters on it, it has flying, vigilance, and haste, and whenever you sacrifice a land, each opponent loses 2 life. So this one's okay. It's focusing more on, in a weird way, aristocrats for sacrificing your lands. You get a payoff of drawing 2 cards when you sacrifice one, and putting an additional land on it, so that is good value. And of course, whenever you're sacrificing those lands, each opponent loses 2 life. That could be a win con, especially if you have like a scape shift in the deck. I like this. However, I do feel like station is a little bit more limiting as a commander goes, because if this gets removed, you have to station it all over again, rinse and repeat. So this is more of an aristocrat style commander where you get those drain effects. And then there is the backup commander, Sarzel Genesis Shepherd, and I gotta say honestly, this is more of my speed. For 2 black, red, and a green, it's legendary creature, insect druid with flying, and it has the ability you may play lands from your graveyard. So already this is pretty good. A Crucible Worlds on a commander is nothing to scoff at, but of course has more abilities. Whenever you sacrifice another non-token permanent during your turn, you put a number of +1/+1 counters equal to Sarzel's power up to 1 other target creature, so this could be really good. It acts as a win con payoff. The more non-token permanents you sacrifice, the more you could buff up creatures on the table. And of course, if you increase the power of Sarzel, you could buff up other creatures as well. So I gotta say, overall, I like this one more than Hearthhole. Both of these are pretty good as commanders, but I don't like how you have to get a little bit more setup for Hearthhole. I'd rather get the payoff and the win con with Sarzel on the battlefield. Plus, the more creatures you have, the more you could buff up all of them and go to town and go for a lot of damage. But of course, you do you. You choose which one you want to go with. I'm going to be building around this deck and upgrading it with Sarzel. And maybe later on, I'll build a unique deck with 1 or 2 of these commanders individually, where there's not really a set limit budget. So now that I've talked about the 2 commanders and which one I'm going to be upgrading with, I am now going to focus on some of the new cards. I'm going to talk about some of my favorite ones. I'm not going to go over every single one. I'm going to go over like 3 to 5. So let's start off big with one of my favorite art pieces of the entire set, and that's Baloth Prime. I love this because it exemplifies every sci-fi creature and everyone willing to go closer to 1. In a weird way, this kind of feels like the movie trope of like exploring a creature, looking at it, studying at it, and then eventually when it breaks out, all chaos breaks loose. And I feel like this doesn't do it justice. This is a very cool art piece. Besides the point, what does this do? For 3 and a green, this creature enters tapped with 6 stun counters on it. Whenever you sacrifice a land, create a tapped 4/4 beast creature token and untap this creature. You pay 4, sacrifice a land, you gain 2 life, and it also has a 10/10 body. So this is very cool. I love the design of this. Definitely more flavorful if anything else, because it's stuck in the ice. Of course, the more you mess with it, the more you're going to find out. Plus, it's just a big 10/10 for 4 mana. Of course, there's some downsides, but of course, when you sacrifice lands, you get to make a beast token and untap this creature. So again, love this card. I want more of these type of designs where there's some downsides, but it could be an upside. Let's move on to the next one, and this one is interesting. Horizon Explorer for 2 and a green. Lands you control enter untapped, and whenever you attack a player, create a lander token, and of course, you're attacking one player, but if you attack 3 players, you're going to be making 3 lander tokens, which essentially are just rampant growths on a token. You sacrifice them, search for your library for a land, and put it onto the battlefield tapped. However, with Horizon Explorer, they will enter untapped. This is a very good ramp piece, especially because the more people you attack, the more you can get those tokens, and of course, if you have token doublers, the more lander tokens you can make. This is a very neat design. Another great design of a card is Avendo Brush Razor. Whenever you sacrifice a non-token permanent, exile the top card of your library, so eventually it's like pseudo card advantage, and during your turn, as long as you sacrifice the non-token permanent this turn, you may play cards exiled with this creature, and that's very nice because sometimes with those exile effects, they're only until on a turn. Whenever you sacrifice another non-token permanent, you could play a card you exiled last turn because this is on the battlefield. And not only that, it does have a sacrifice ability by tapping, sacrificing a land, and a 2 mana. And this could be extra useful because you could tap that mana, sacrifice that land, and then get more mana with that little ritual. So I think this is a pretty neat design. I know a lot of people don't like sacrificing their lands, but this is just great value overall, getting you pseudo card draw, along with giving you acceleration on mana. And the last card I wanted to talk about is Exploration Broodship. It has the station ability. If you have 3 charge counters on it, you may play additional land on each of your turns. And if you have 8 charge counters on it, once during each of your turns, you may cast a permanent spell from your graveyard by sacrificing a land in addition to it paying its other costs. So this is basically an exploration, but a little bit more. Obviously, it has the name in it. You do get more things. It's a 4/4 body when you get a station to the last ability, and you could play cards from your graveyard that are permanents. And the fact that this is only 1 green mana makes this an excellent choice on a lot of different landfall strategies. So I'd highly recommend putting this in a lot of different landfall decks outside of this deck too. But besides that point, those are some of my favorite cards. I didn't go over every single new card. I just wanted to go over my personal favorites. Of course, there's some great reprints too. And weirdly enough, a lot of legendary creatures like Braid's Arisen Nightmare, which could get you card draw when you sacrifice a specific permanent like a land. Got Eternal Bontu. If you sacrifice all your lands and all your permanents, you can get a bunch of card draw. And if you have Sarzel as your commander, or even the other commander, the more you can get value out of sacrificing those non-token permanents. Morog will get you extra combats. Oracle Modiah is a huge reprint, playing more additional lands during your turn and playing from the top of your library. Titania is an excellent choice because you're sacrificing those lands, and when they enter the graveyard, you're making a 5/3 elemental creature. The Gitrog monster will get you more card draw, along with Korvold, Faker's King, when you're sacrificing those permanents. Omnath, Locust of Rage. Again, the list could go on and on. Soul of Windgrace. There is a lot of good legendary creatures that they put in the set, and honestly, they all work pretty well with this strategy of lands going to the graveyard or even on the battlefield. So either way, it's going to be a win-win. But now I wanted to shift my focus and talk about 10 cards you should take out and then 10 cards you should put in. To first start it off, I'm going to talk about 10 cards you should take out. And let's start out with Night's Whisper. I'm not a big fan of this just because you're just drawing 2 cards and you lose 2 life. That's not going to be getting us too much value, even though it is 2 mana. I think it's a little bit more limited and there's some better options. The same can be applied for Gaze of Granite. You pay X, 2 black and a green. Destroy each non-land permanent with mana value X or less. That's okay. However, there are better board wipes that we could utilize. Instead of paying X of that cost, we could use some cheaper alternative methods. Groundskeeper is another one that I don't think is necessarily good, even though it can be useful. In total, we have about 16 basics in this deck. Most likely, some of them are not going to be in the graveyard. They could just be on the battlefield. Returning a target basic land card from your graveyard to your hand is not necessarily going to be good, especially when knowing our commander is a Crucible of Worlds effect. It's not necessarily worth it. Another card I'm not necessarily fond of is Sprouting Goblin. It has the kicker mode. When this creature enters, if it was kicked, search your library for a land card with a basic land type, reveal it and put it into your hand, then shuffle. You pay a red, tap a sacrifice land, and draw a card. This is fine. I mean, for 3 mana, you're searching your library for a land, and it's a repeatable option as far as sacrificing a land and drawing a card. That could be okay, especially with our commander. However, I think there's better options. Moving on to the next one, I think Jury Master of the Revu is one you could possibly take out. I know some people like this card. Whenever you sacrifice a permanent, you put +1/+1 counter on Jury, but when Jury dies it deals damage equal to its power to any target, so it's like a fling effect on a body. This can be worth it in the deck, however you're sacrificing more lands where you might not be able to sacrifice this at the right time. It could be a ticking time bomb. This could be in there, it could not be in there. I personally took it out. Another card that is actually pretty decent, but I personally don't like it for the deck, is Escape to the Wilds. This could be a high risk, high reward kind of play. You exile the top 5 cards of your library, you may play cards exiled this way until the end of your next turn, and as the ability you may play additional land on this turn, which again can be useful for more land drops. However, there's more points than not where the cards that you exile are going to stay in exile unless they're all lands, but then again some of them might be still in exile. This one's a little bit too risky for me, keeping certain cards in exile that I actually want to have later on. I would prefer other options that put cards into our hands rather than stay in exile. Another card that just kind of gets stuck into precons that are just there because they just kind of work with the deck is Satyr Wayfinder. This is okay, it's just an ETB of putting one land card into your hand and putting the rest into the graveyard. It's just a one-time ETB for 2 mana. There's a lot better effects that we could utilize that I'll talk about later, but this is one that I would take out. And for the last 3 cards I'm going to take out, they're actually from the land base. Normally I don't touch the land base, but because this is a Lands Matter Precon, there are some lands that I think are going to be not very good and can be replaceable with others. First of all, I don't know why a waste is in here. I know World Breaker is an option that you have to use colorless mana to sacrifice a land and return this card from your graveyard to your hand. However, we can tap for colorless with other options like Llanowar Wastes or Karpuslan Forest, so the wastes could go. I'm also not a big fan of the cheap fetch lands like Rocky Tar Pit or even Evolving Wilds. That could also apply for Terramorphic Expanse, of course, that is going over 10 cards. But the land base I feel like can be better to fit the landfall theme. So those are some of the cards I would take out, but now I wanted to transition into cards that you should put in. And this first card is a must, and this is the first card I thought about honestly when I looked at this commander and what it's doing with a Crucible Worlds in the command zone. Nahiri's Lithoforming is a perfect card for this deck. You pay X into its cost with 2 red, sacrifice X lands. For each land card sacrificed this way, draw a card. You may play X additional lands this turn. Lands you control enter the battlefield tapped this turn. So what's very good about this commander is the fact that when you sacrifice all those lands, you could play them from the graveyard to the battlefield because of that Crucible Worlds ability, and then you draw a bunch of cards on top of that. So to me, this is a pretty sweet combination. Also, your commander might be a removal magnet because if you keep sacrificing cards, you're going to be buffing up a lot of creatures. That might be scary for a lot of different opponents, so you may want to use something like Sylvan Safekeeper. This is only 1 green mana, sacrifice a land, target creature you control gains Shroud until end of turn. Your commander will be protected when you sacrifice a land, and plus, not only that, you could buff up another creature when you sacrifice this land with your commander. This got reprinted pretty recently in Modern Horizons, and it's only like $3, so definitely one that is a great pickup range because it used to be pretty expensive. The same can be applied for Lotus Cobra. This is a great option as far as getting an acceleration on mana when you put lands onto the battlefield, especially when you get a fetch land on the battlefield, you sacrifice that land and put another land on the battlefield. That's 2 mana. You're just getting off of that landfall trigger. And it's also kind of in that same area where Sylvan Safekeeper is, around that $3 to $4 range too. I did also want to bring up a couple of fetch lands that fetch for the color specific for this type of deck, like Bloodstained Mire and Wooded Foothills, and the only reason why I'm bringing this up is because they're only about $10 to $13 each. That is incredibly cheap for fetch lands. Normally I wouldn't recommend these if they were up in the $20, $30, even $40 range, but because they are so cheap, around $10 to $13, I think they're absolutely worth it for this type of deck where our commander is a Crucible of Worlds. So I would replace these with those other lands like Evolving Wilds, where you're getting much more than just a basic. You could get a non-basic. Of course, you could add more fetch lands for redundancy. I only just mentioned 2, mainly because they're just so cheap right now. However, another card that I think is perfect for this type of deck that kind of goes along with the fetch lands are cards that let you play more than 1 land per turn, something like Dryad of the Elysian Grove or Azusa Lost But Seeking. I know they're around that like $10 range, but I think they're so worth it for this type of deck, especially with fetch lands and our commander. Say for example you have Azusa with a fetch land and your commander, you could potentially sacrifice your fetch lands multiple times, getting a lot of different creatures bigger, having them go to the graveyard, replaying them, sacrificing them again over and over again. So that is kind of like the dream scenario. Of course, the more redundancy of these kind of effects, the more we could just splurt out all our lands onto the battlefield and get a huge army with huge power. And now with these last 3 cards, I wanted to focus on cards that help build up your commander's power, so that way we could build up the power of other creatures, and then in return can build up our commander's power back and forth. The prime example of this would be Hana and Alayla partners, mainly because at the beginning of combat on your turn, you put a +1/+1 counter on another target creature you control where X is Hana and Alayla's power. That creature gains haste until on a turn. So this kind of goes hand in hand with our commander. We put 2/1 counters on our commander, and then if we sacrifice a permanent, we get to put 4/1 counters on Hana and Alayla, and then following that, we get to put 6/1 counters on our commander, and then kind of back and forth. They work very well with each other. And with this next card, I wanted to focus on Forgotten Agent. This is going to be incredible in this type of deck. Whenever a player casts a spell, you may put a +1/+1 counter on Forgotten Ancient, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you may move any number of +1/+1 counters on Forgotten Ancient onto another creature. So let's just say you had 5/1 counters on it. We can move those 5/1 counters on it to our commander, and then in turn, when we sacrifice a permanent, we get to put that many 1/1 counters on Forgotten Ancient, and then going back to our upkeep, we could kind of just return those back to our commander, and so on and so forth. This could help get our commander huge and Forgotten Ancient huge, or other creatures we control. And the last card I would like to talk about is Greater Good. This is possibly one of the best cards you could throw in this deck because it has the ability to sacrifice a creature, draw cards equal to the sacrificed creature's power, then discard 3 cards. So there's 2 things going for this. The fact that we're buffing up our creatures based off of our commander is huge. Whenever we sacrifice a creature, we get to put that many 1/1 counters on another creature based off of our creature's power. And of course, when we sacrifice that creature, we get to draw that many cards based off of its power. This is just a sticky enchantment that will draw us so many cards and potentially put a lot of lands into our graveyard that we could cast later on with our commander's Crucible Worlds-like effect ability. So if there's any card out of all the cards that I've talked about today, Greater Good is an absolute staple. Will get you so much card draw, will help your commander out buffing up your creatures, and then putting more lands into your graveyard. What's not to like about this card? So those are the 10 cards I would put in the deck. I also wanted to highlight some cards from the main set that would be very good. I didn't mention them in the 10 card upgrade, mainly because I don't know what their price points are going to be yet, so I don't know if they're going to be budget or not. But I would like to quickly highlight some, like Famished Worldsire, that has Devour Land 3, which could enter the battlefield. Look at the top X cards of your library, where X is the creature's power. Put any number of land cards from among them onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle them. This is going to be huge on the battlefield, sacrificing a bunch of lands for us, and then getting more lands on top of that. I also like Ouroborid. At the beginning of combat on your turn, you put X 1/1 counters on each creature you control, where X is this creature's power. So very similar to our commander, but of course this is an exponential type of growth effect because this is happening each combat. So first it'll be 1 counter, then 2 counters, then 4 counters, then 8 counters, then 16 counters, so on and so forth. Of course, if you buff this up with your commander, the more counters you're going to be putting on other creatures you control. Another card from the main set that focuses on power is Mightform Harmonizer. This is going to be extremely good with your commander. It has the landfall ability. When a land you control enters the battlefield, double the power of target creature you control until on a turn. So like your commander, you could buff it up to 4 power, then if another land enters, 8 power, then so on and so forth, 16 power. And of course, when you sacrifice anything, you get to put that many 1/1 counters on another creature like Mightform Harmonizer. This is pretty cracked. And because you're putting so much 1/1 counters on creatures, Terra Symbiosis is an excellent choice. Whenever you put 1 or more 1/1 counters on a creature you control, you may draw that many cards. Do this only once each turn. This is incredible because at base, if you have 2 power with your commander and you sacrifice a land, you essentially get to draw 2 cards on top of that. Of course, the more power you do have with your commander, the more you're able to draw cards by putting counters on your other creatures. So this is another excellent choice. Of course, all these cards can be swapped in too. Just kind of pick which ones you like that I've talked about. I know technically it is 14 cards that I've talked about today that you could put in and 10 cards that you could take out. I just wanted to highlight some of the standard ones that could be excellent in this type of deck. I just don't know where the prices are going to be at this point, but of course, if you see it in the future, you can let me know if these are budget or not. However, that is going to do it for me, guys. Thank you guys so much for coming by and watching this video on upgrading the new World Shaper Precon deck. This is a very cool and interesting deck. I think the other deck has a little bit more value going on, but I think this has a lot more synergy going on. I love the idea of landfall. I mean, I know a lot of people don't like landfall as a strategy because it's kind of boring, but this kind of takes it in a different spin. It focuses much more on sacrificing the lands. That could be a positive and also a negative too, because if somebody's playing a lot of graveyard hate, well, goodbye to your lands. But outside of that, again, I think this deck looks very fun. I think both commanders look very interesting in their design. And of course, there's plenty of other cards that you could put in this deck to make it tuned up and ready to go against the more of those high power tables. But since this is just a 10 card Precon upgrade, let me know down below in the comments if you would like to see a full deck tech of either of these commanders. I would love to hear your thoughts down below. What other cards did I miss? Also, let me know what other cards would you take out. I know there's some Precons that have some pretty bad land bases. I know I didn't touch on them too much besides a couple, but without further ado, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. And with that out of the way, thank you for stomping by.